I get the icon in cornflower blue?
All right, hey everybody, welcome to episode 17 of Can I Get That Software in Blue? I'm one of your hosts, Chad Tyndall, and along with me is my co-host, the MVP of VPs, the Sultana of Grafana. He hails from Arizona, but he'd rather be eating jamon in Barcelona, Steve Mazak.
Oh, I like the new one. Welcome to everybody. Thank you, Chad, for the always funny and fun intro.
And I know you love your jamon in Barcelona, so I thought that worked. It rhymed with Arizona. Yeah. I had to run with it.
I cannot wait.
We're joined today by a wonderful guest, someone Steve and I have both worked with in previous lives. She's currently an executive at IBM Consulting, leading their AI and analytics practice as an advocate for ethics and artificial intelligence. She's also the CEO of the AI Leadership Institute and previously worked in AI roles at Microsoft and the Amazon Alexa groups. And before that, in various solution architect and product management roles at VMware, Red Hat, and IBM. I'm envious because she lives in Miami, where the beach is within reach. She's the tech exec who signs the check. Everyone who meets her knows she has a heart of gold. Noelle Silver, welcome to the show.
Awesome. I was wondering if I was going to get some rhymes, and you did. You threw down. That's awesome.
Had to do it. And in honor of you joining us from the gateway to the Keys, I've got refreshing LaCroix key lime flavor today.
Appreciate that. That's awesome. Represent, man. I love it.
No kidding.
I'm like, what do I got? I got nothing. Well, I was nice enough to close the blinds because sometimes people are like, really? Do you have to with the palm
It's just
trees?
like a beach and right there.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that.
Same thing.
I look like I could be in Ohio right now. For all
You could be. It could be raining outside for all we know.
Exactly.
Yeah. Your vitamin D deficiency isn't showing yet, though, so that would be the giveaway.
All right, well, let's start with your title, which is Partner AI and Analytics. What does partner mean in this context? Because when I think about that, I think about like a law firm or, a big consulting practice where you have to buy in and you're providing sort of equity money as part of becoming a partner. So what does that mean here?
Yeah, so it's a little bit different. It's actually reverse. It's the first level of executive where you actually get equity in the business in large amounts. And that also means that I don't have direct people reporting to me like in my earlier days where I built teams. Now I'm responsible for the success of large groups of people, but they don't report to me. I'm not their manager, right? So I own the P&L, if you will, that I'm responsible for bringing in the money and delivering the results, but I don't own any of the people that do that work. So as a partner, really it indicates the fact that I have no control directly over my own success. It's 100%
That's counterintuitive.
built, yeah, on partnership, on collaboration, on relationship building, which is why the team at IBM thought I'd be successful because I have a lot of, and as you know, this world is so very small when we get into these AI and analytics and big data groups. And many of us started in middleware or maybe even just before that in client server. So the more relationship you have, the more successful you are as an executive in this specific area. So I was at IBM actually first, and then Red Hat, and then VMware, and then the EMC thing turned to Pivotal, and then AWS, and then the fact that I spent a few years at all these companies actually made me kind of a perfect candidate for a consulting executive.
So you're selling consulting contracts to large clients, and then someone in IBM goes and delivers it. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, technically, someone else does the selling. So I don't like hot and cold. I don't like the contract. Will you please do this for us? And then the closing of the contract, please sign here. Like, I don't like that part. I like coming in the middle and being like, here's the dream of what we can do.
You're selling the vision.
Yeah.
Okay.
Art of the possible.
Come in. Yes, the art of the possible. But the difference is so I influenced $600 million in revenue at Microsoft in 2019. Best year ever. I was like, this is amazing. But I only sold the dream. I had no accountability for delivering on what I sold. And so going into the pandemic, I was like, all right, I don't want to do that anymore. So I ended up leaving the big tech world and going to NPR, National Public Radio. And I was their head of engineering. And I then became the customer, right? And I was like, I see what happens when someone sells me a dream. And then it's like, good luck with that. You bought, $3 million in this software, like have a good time, hope it works out. And I'm like, wait, but aren't you going to build it, architect it, tell me what's right, wrong, give me a path? Not necessarily. So that's why I'm back on the other side going, okay, now I know how to do this.
When you say you get equity in the business, what does that mean?
Standard RSU equity, just probably in
okay.
larger scale, certainly larger scale than I've had in my career. But also I'm on the executive team. So I get privy information to, and also, of course, it changes my ability to
You're an insider.
independently. Yes, exactly. I could be
Yeah.
Martha Stewart, for God's sake. Yeah, so I have to be very careful about how I share information. But that started at NPR was my first executive job, similarly, where I was now in a position where I couldn't really be a normal, hey, I just work here, right? Like now I actually own a share of that business. And so I can't just work here. I'm ultimately responsible for its success, which is cool. I like it.
Yeah, that is cool. Well, let's just dive in deep here
Sure.
right off the bat. You had mentioned middleware. You were an SA for a few years on the JBoss side of the house at Red Hat. At the time, we probably had about 100 SAs in North America, and you were the only female SA I remember.
Yes, I'm so glad I have to come back to you and have people like people don't believe me because it was not long ago, and I'm like, yes, I swear I was the only woman globally in the role. It was
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah, I couldn't remember if there might have been one in Europe or something, but I knew for
Yeah,
sure that there was not another one in North
there were
America.
3 when I left, but when I started, there were none.
Why do you think there's so few women in the SA role? I mean, especially because and I know the ratios aren't necessarily equal, but there's plenty
Of
of
course,
women in engineering. There's plenty of women, and it's not because of the travel requirements, because
right,
there's lots of female sales reps and there's female
right.
executives at all these companies. So why is it that that role in particular has such a dearth, do you think, of women?
I think it's well, solutions architecture one is it seems easy, but it's actually pretty hard, right? It combines people, very specific type of people who like to talk the talk, but then are also more passionate about actually implementing the thing, right? So we don't go in and we just show slides. Like we usually use slides to maybe get into a conversation. The very next thing we're building a demo. Sometimes we build it the night after we talk to them and show it to them the next day. It's very high velocity. It's also very familial, right? Like, so I find like I was brought into Red Hat because Kevin Barfield at the time, right, knew me, saw me, was like, "Oh my gosh, you'd make a great cultural fit to the team. And you've got enough technical aptitude to pick up." I didn't know J Boss. He was looking for someone who would fit the culture. And I think sometimes, especially if you're going to take someone who's like a underrepresented group, it's hard. It takes a lot of courage to bring someone who looks like an outsider and kind of mush them into a culture where everyone else looks different. It takes a leader who's willing to do that. And I just don't think a lot of leaders are willing to sacrifice really this gelled familial sense you get in a lot of SA teams by saying, okay, we're going to we're going to let someone who's not the same in. Some people do. Like I said, we had that luxury. Now we're seeing it more than ever. But that's on the team side. On the individual side, it's also really hard to be the only one, right? We're already the only one, like in a tech world, but then to be the only one in a solutions architecture role, it's a hard row to plow. So I understand why women, or even anyone who thinks a little differently than like the people that they're around, it's a decision you have to make really open-mindedly. And a lot of people are like, wait, I could just, go do this other thing that's less difficult to do. But yeah, it takes a special breed. But that's true for essays in general. I feel like a lot of women also don't know that it's an option, don't realize that it's an option, because there aren't many of us essays talking, and those that are talking are working really hard. We're not, like now I take a lot of stages, but in those years, I didn't do hardly any. I never talked about my story or why I was doing what I was like heads down trying to make my number. So I think that's also a big part of it is a lot of women are like, I don't know anybody who does that and has fun doing it. The other side of that also is people who do talk about it tend not to talk positively about that
Yeah, I
experience.
was
And
just gonna say that that's one of the
yeah,
problems I've seen a lot is like, yeah, you're finally actually able to attract some women to your team, and then somewhere along the way something happens, and it's like, okay, there's one dark mark on the
yes,
culture, then there's
yes,
another dark mark on the culture, and you get to
yes,
this point where like you're working with veterans in the industry that have more bad stories about sales culture than good,
yes,
and they're telling their colleagues like they should, right? Because they're trying to protect other women from what they deem as bad, which I don't disagree with. Like,
yeah,
yeah, these things shouldn't be happening. And
yeah,
it is so discouraging as a male leader, white man leader.
yeah,
Like, I'm trying to make my team more diverse and eventually replace myself with someone that's underrepresented.
right.
And it's like I'm trying to undo bad leadership, bad culture, bad behavior all at the same time.
Yeah, and it's really difficult and unfortunate because I actually think, to your point, like in our, I always called it like my golden years at Red Hat because we had a really great team, and I never saw in like gender or ethnicity. It didn't even blip on the radar. It was just like the hard team to work. Like it was you had to go through that check ride and like had to certify and
It was hardcore. Yeah.
it was hardcore, right?
Yeah.
Like you were going to be part of a SWAT team. So there was this prestige that just really didn't, I never really saw it that way. But to your point, then a couple stories get out and people will judge. And I say this all the time to women, we tend to judge an entire organization for a single bad group of people that we hear about. And the magic is really finding that team that you resonate with, less functionally, but more culturally. And they're in every company. Like I left Amazon, I left Microsoft because I was in a bad team and couldn't see my way out. And so now I try to encourage women to not, when they jump, like jump to another team. Don't jump like out of the entire organization or worse, out of the entire industry because of one bad experience. But that is also, I think, a bit cultural that as women, we tend to do that, which is not good for us to stay.
So what should we be doing to get more women to join this career path?
Yeah, well, I'll say one thing that companies don't like doing is creating public faces, right? Like that whole developer advocacy, that was not a thing when we first were doing it. But even those companies that have invested in building developer advocates and making sure that they're, like a symphony of different types of people. And that's the purpose of a group like that, evangelists, having evangelist teams, especially now as we go into this perceived maybe recession or contraction in the economy. It's the first thing they cut, right? It's the first thing they let go is having public faces of what your company is or who your company is or what they do. But that's how everyone that I've talked to that's gotten a job in tech, they say the reason they did is because they saw me on a stage somewhere and they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I could do that. I had a geneticist who was going to school at MIT, saw me speak in Boston, and then ended up like going through the motions, getting a degree, I think getting a minor or something in data science, and now is running ethical AI at Microsoft. Like it's a path that she never thought was possible until she saw someone openly and transparently talk about how fun it was. She was like, oh, I could do that. And I have lots of emails of people who are like, oh my gosh, I saw you talk in 2015. And since then, now I just got my first job at, Spotify or whatever, all in technical careers. But a lot of it's because there's just no visibility. So increasing visibility, having your women who work for you take stages, like be proud of their story, tell their story. Most of the time, these women will be the first to be like, oh no, my buddy Bob here is much better on the stage than I am. And it's those kind of women we need to be like, I understand that, but you're pretty good too. We should encourage you
Yeah,
to speak.
yeah. Well, in investing, like this may get me canceled, which is fine, but like as a leader who's trying to build a diverse team, I will go above and beyond to get someone that's underrepresented onto the team and then invest in their future. And sometimes it gets me in trouble, I think, because I wait too long to make a firing decision when I should have. It's tough because you're like, I really wanted this to work out and it's not going to work out, and it becomes obvious and you're like, maybe this will work. But I do think that's something that we have to do. And no one wants to talk about it, that I can tell, because it's kind of taboo to say, I'm going to invest more in this person than that person. But if we want to solve this problem, please tell me how else to do it, right?
No,
Like, you have
exactly.
to invest your time somewhere.
Especially when it's systemic like that, because there's no way. I always tell people, our problem is not necessarily pipeline from an entry level position. It's what happens once they get that first job. I remember a company I was working for, I hired someone. This woman stated that the income she wanted, the salary she wanted, was 40 grand less than everyone else on the team. And the company was like, awesome, what a deal. We'll give her 20 grand more than she's asking, but it still leveled her down 20 grand compared to the rest of her team.
Yeah, and those things compound for
yeah.
every raise and everything else.
Yes,
Yeah.
like it's done. That she's
Yep.
now on that path for the rest of her career. And I wasn't part of this, but my organization was like, Pat, we gave her 20 grand more than she wanted.
Yeah.
And then you have to decide, okay, so now I pay them more than I think they're worth, which is ultimately what ended up happening, right? They decided they didn't want to pay her more because if she didn't value herself that much, then she
That's
shouldn't be worth,
ironic.
right? Like it's
Yeah,
so
that's so
bizarre.
backwards.
Like
Yeah.
where you're sitting there,
Yeah.
I'm like, and then you think 20 years from now where she's going to be. She's going to be looking around
Yeah.
going, why do I make half of what my peers make? Oh, because of a decision I made at 22 years old.
I would love for someone to say, who on your team is the highest paid best person? I want 10 grand more than them. I don't know what I would say to that if someone said that. And hopefully if someone's listening to this and they interview with me later, bring this
Yeah.
up and watch what I say because I don't know yet. I'll have to think about
But
that.
if nothing else, you got to give a props, right? For like,
Yeah.
I
Well,
hope
you should value your own worth, and you should value it highly.
but I think
If you're
that's
gonna
also
give a
part of it.
number, you should give a number that you think is too high, and
Yeah.
because let them come down. But they might also just say yes. You don't know.
Yeah.
But to your point
And
around waiting, like you waited too long to fire, but a lot of people don't have the patience to wait enough to hire, right? So like
yeah,
this pipeline is not full of diverse candidates that
that's
are
right.
all at the same level. So I am also a proponent of waiting, but then even hiring someone that's underqualified, that has the right
Yeah.
aptitude, that shows
Yeah.
the right stuff, and then developing them. And again, I will get some heat from my leadership saying, all right, but that person, you can't pay that person that if they haven't done that. I'm like, give me 6 months and then you can let them
Yeah.
go if it doesn't
Yeah.
work out. But I think that's part of it. You do have to combat this systemic challenge that they're going to face by being willing to be a leader who's like, okay, I see you, I see what you're capable of, but you're going to have to work really hard over the next 6 months because I'm going to support your, acceleration. But it's tough because not a lot of companies support that. What it brings me to this, I think I saw it on Netflix. It was called This Changes Everything. And it was all about women directors in Hollywood and their struggle with the very same problem. And what it took to actually tip the scale of parity in gender in directorship was a white male CEO at Sony saying, we will now only, it will be 50-50 from now on. But if we hit a 50% mark of hiring male directors, the rest of the directors for that year will have to be female. And he stood that line and then convinced the rest, this was years ago now, but it was very interesting because it does actually take, we can't do it like a brown person is not going to change these systemic challenges. Like it's going to take a really influx of, white male leaders to say enough is enough. We're going which is what you're doing, right?
Steve, what do you think would happen if you said that you're only going to hire 50% females at Grafana?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think the first thing that would happen after everyone says that's impossible would be we would start missing our hiring targets for quarters upon quarters, to Noelle's point about like the pipeline isn't there right now and we're not patient. So
You don't think you could go out and find them?
You'd have to train them, I think.
we'd have to try many different channels, more than we're trying today. We'd have to reach into universities in the STEM programs at the very least. But the funny thing is, like, I didn't go to college, so you wouldn't find people like me.
neither.
Noelle, I think you didn't go to college either. Like, you didn't even get a diploma, you said on your last
Mhm.
podcast. Like,
Yeah.
so how would I find people like Noelle if I'm only going to the universities? Which is why I think
Yeah.
a multi-pronged strategy is necessary. And Noelle, I listened to your podcast that you did with the Latinas from the,
Oh yeah.
was it from the
Latinas
block
from
to the
the block.
boardroom?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one thing in there is like that opened my eyes a little bit to this idea that there's other groups out there that I am not even aware of that we could tap into. So I think it would require more investment up front, which a lot of companies don't want to do because it's really hard to guarantee the return on that, right? And that's a risk that someone's going to have to take. So Chad, that's what I think would happen if I said that.
I mean, if you happen to be a CEO of like a 250,000 person company, sure, because you have the mindset to make a choice like that.
I don't know. I think it'd be easier to make that kind of edict at a small company where, I don't know, what's your hiring goal for next quarter? 10 people? I don't even know, 15. But we're not talking about like tens of thousands of people you'd have to go find immediately. Like, I feel like it's more realistic at a small company because the numbers are smaller.
But I
Yeah.
think we're also being a little bit myopic. Like it's not just about 50% men and women.
Right.
So there's more to diversity than just gender, right?
symphony.
So
Obviously,
like,
you just got to start somewhere, though. That was my point, right? It's like,
yeah, but that's the question. Like, Noelle, if you were going to do this, would you say, like, if you started a company tomorrow, would you start with the edict that it's going to be 50% men, 50% women, or would it be we're going to have a different kind of pie?
Yeah, so I'm a huge proponent of what I call inclusive engineering, right? Is that, and they could maybe all be white and male and female, but they wouldn't all be the same, which is the challenge that I have now is I literally go into a room and everyone's pretty much the same. Sometimes they're from the same part of the country. Like they're all, from the Northeast and they went to a school where they played against each other in high school. Like there's these synergies that when someone from the outside, even if it was just someone from California who looked just like them, they find instant friction on that team because that team is so, and it seems good because everyone seems to agree all the time, but it doesn't end up producing software that serves the rest of the world. And that's my mission, of course, is to build software that serves everyone. But my mission now is more like I want to look around and I don't want anyone to be the same. Like it's hard to build metrics around that, of course, but I'd like to have someone who's compassionate to neurodiversity, and someone else who's compassionate to maybe physical disability, someone else who is a caregiver of their parents, someone else who's a young mom, someone else who's, a single dad. Like those experiences just change how they show up at work, right? When their personal lives are so diverse. And the funny thing about that is that now I care more about who they are at home before I hire them, right? So my behavioral questioning when I hire someone is a lot about how do you make decisions every day? How do you learn new things? Have you ever wanted to start a company? What did that process look like? How far did you get? When did you quit? What made you quit? Like those things tell me more about a person than their ability to do the functional part of whatever job I'm hiring for. So I'm less about like ethnic and gender diversity, though those are easy ways to get neurodiversity on a team. But I'm much more about like, let me know who you are. And then if that is something that we don't have represented on our team, like it's almost like a matrix or a scorecard, right? Like, do I have someone that represents all these different demographics? But it's hard. And like you said, diversity is expensive. Inclusion is expensive. It's way more expensive than not doing it. And most companies have no appetite for like why, if they can get an 80% solution that serves, 80% of their customers perfectly well without inclusion, there's no incentive to do that work.
Well, speaking of topics that you're an expert in, you spending a lot of time these days talking about ethics in AI and ethical AI. What does that mean, ethical AI?
I recently got an award from VentureBeat on ethics and responsible AI. And I tend to be on the responsible side, which is really around accountability, right? Like responsibility and accountability kind of go hand in hand on the AI side, which means that ethics is hard. Ethics is Tesla having to make a decision when its autonomous model is trying to decide, do I hit the dog or the human, or do I hit the old human or the young human?
So this is like
And
the trolley problem.
Yes! Oh my gosh, I showed that video. Oh, it was a disaster because I was, like, emotionally, attached to the poor people who got hit by the trolley. But yes, exactly that. I don't have a lot of executives that I talk to, and I'm usually in, like, the C-suite senior executive where I'm trying to encourage them to invest in responsible AI. There's not a lot of enthusiasm for ethical AI. Like, "Hey, I wanna make sure I don't build, a model that kills people," because they inherently don't think that they're doing anything that special, even though they might be. So I switched gears a little bit to get more engagement at the executive level to say, well, let's then, if you're not going to worry about like ethical AI because you don't think your models are doing like you're doing, like ways you could figure out who to sell more stuff to, right? You don't think anyone could really be hurt or who to give credit to. So let's talk about what you should do to make sure you don't hurt anyone, right? Basically, these design principles that allow us to not just think about the happy path, which as engineers, like that's always the first thing we do, right? Is define the good way we do something. But now in AI projects, we also then very quickly and early on define the unhappy or what we call harmful paths, right? So harmfulness in AI is very rarely discussed at the beginning of projects and very rarely monitored. And so that's the work I do now is I really educate companies if you're going to build models and use them at scale, what are the questions you should be asking at the beginning so that when you build it, at the beginning at Microsoft, for example, I was part of the cognitive services team. We had 100 calls coming into our AI models a month. Like, who's going to get hurt at 100 calls a month? But those same exact models have now scaled. They're getting 2.3 to 4 billion calls per month. Now, if that data ends up being wrong, a lot more people are impacted by the result of those models, right? And you don't know how big those models are going to be. Alexa was the same way. When we started, no one thought that many people would want to talk to a kitchen device. Turns out it's not a kitchen device. It's in nursing homes, it's in classrooms, right? The people have more than one of them in their house. They're having it in their car. All of a sudden, the scope of your problems get much, much bigger, but it's still running on the same code you built when you thought 5 people were using it. And so there's a lot of questions that I now say, hey, you might be, you're like one acquisition away from the Death Star. Like you need to make sure that whatever you build responsibly so that you can track. And with responsible AI, there's like pillars, right? Tenants like security and privacy, transparency, explainability, robustness. Like there's these concepts that Microsoft and Amazon and Facebook have all said, we agree to abide by these rules. Yeah, well, anyway, that's a whole nother.
Well, I mean, outside of decisions that involve, killing someone, a
Yes,
bystander or something. And by the way, if
at the
I'm driving a
car, yeah.
self-driving car, I want my car to save my life, even if it means killing 12
Well,
other
so that's
people.
exactly where Tesla landed, right? Is they said we will do whatever will protect the occupant in the vehicle, which is their stockholder assurance.
Well, I mean, they wouldn't sell cars if people thought their cars were going to kill them. What other types of problems and questions are they dealing with other than those, who to kill?
Well, I'll give you a couple real examples. One is like Amazon Alexa. When I first started, nobody knew what it was. I'd go and speak all over the world, and I would say, "Who knows what Alexa is?" And no one would raise their hand. After a couple of years, people started coming up to me, women specifically, stating that they were concerned about their children named Alexa. And it turns out that there's a bunch of women, 140,000 of them, who either are Alexa or had children named Alexa in around the 2008 period, which would put their children in first or second grade in the largest selling year of Alexa devices, which was around 2015. Really unfortunate timing. But what ended up happening is these little kids started getting bullied at school. These little girls would start getting commanded around like robots in the playground and in school, in classrooms, to the point where those girls did not want to go to school anymore. Like it wasn't even funny. Like it
It's
was
terrible.
hurtful, right? And of course, me, the data science team and the TBMs were like, we had zero intention nor understanding or awareness that would ever be a thing. But are we still responsible for that? Like, what accountability do we have for the impact that those types of things have? And that's just one example on Alexa. I mean, there's lots of different ones where Alexa has accidentally, in its data collection, focused on people who are willing to voluntarily donate their data, right? Which is almost all of us. We checked that little EULA when we got a new Alexa device. It said you can use all my voice data however you want to make it better. The problem is that it's a technical product geared towards the 1% of the 1%. So a certain demographic was primarily the demographic training the data, which happened to be male, central United States male to be exact. So women at the beginning of Alexa's life couldn't get Alexa to respond in the same way that men could. As a matter of fact, husbands would do YouTube videos joking around like, ha ha ha, Alexa doesn't understand my wife, which sounds funny. But again, like, do I want to be that company? Like, is that a
It's
thing I
funny.
want
It's
to be?
funny you mention it. We literally had that problem like 3 days ago. Not with Alexa. We have Google in the kitchen,
Yeah,
but
same thing.
and
Same.
I think Google was smart to not give it a real name, so
Yeah.
to avoid this problem, right? You just say, "Hey
Yeah.
Google." Yeah, my wife couldn't get it to respond, and she's like, "Can you just tell Google to check the timer?"
There's so much
I
wrong
was
with
like, "Oh
that.
my
There's
god."
so much wrong with that, Chad. I am not asking my husband to talk to Google on my behalf. Not happening.
But she tried. She tried like 3 times, and finally she's just like, "I just do it. I
Well,
got to
yeah,
know what
so
the
that's a
timer
data
says."
problem, right? So these are the types of things like how can a company be more responsible? Like same with my son, he has Down syndrome. He's verbal, he can speak, but he speaks differently. Do you think there's any data in that model about him? No.
No way.
So they have now, this is 7, 8 years now into Alexa's life. So they spent the last 2 years building. They have an elder care team that focuses on elder care. They have used to call it the Rudolph team, but they have a kid team that focuses on how kids' language impacts the language model. They've now put a dedicated language model on the device. So they caught up to make sure that they could keep getting more customers and make people happy. But what would have happened if we actually went out of the gate with that, right? With that intention? There would have been a bunch of women who are like, oh, it actually works for me, which might have changed the trajectory since women have a lot of buying power in the United States. And then, of course, let me complement that with there's about 14 different government regulations coming down the pipes to say you can't use what's called black box AI, right? You can't buy an AI that is an easy button. You click it and magic happens for your company. And the reason for, I don't know if you know HireVue or what happened with them, but they ended up building this facial recognition model for hiring, which was meant to tag behaviors that would say, do you really want to spend time with this person or not? So they do a video, you analyze their video. However, the characteristics of the person getting interviewed would be tagged to things like low confidence or lack of communication skills, when actually, when human reviewed, looked more like neurodivergence, right? Like shyness, introversion, right? Not comfortable with being on camera, like those types of things. But it translated to these really negative characteristics in a hiring profile, which then eliminated those people entirely, which is actually people you want on your team. So it was interesting though, because they went to market and they had only tested people who were confident, right? They had only really collected data with people who wanted to be recorded. So their data was instantly biased. And so these are the kind of problems we need companies to think about. Like, hey, you might be solving a problem, but you might also be completely marginalizing an entire, part of the world. So let's make sure you're thinking about that before you go to production.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And that's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Right.
crazy. I
It's
have
crazy.
two of my kids are autistic, and they won't look you in the eyes, which,
Right.
right, for a model like that probably comes across as nervous or,
Yep.
shifty or like whatever,
Right.
like they're trying to get one over on you or something, right? They're doing something
Yes.
wrong, but really they're just their brain won't let them do that.
That's right. Exactly. And they're cognitively capable. I mean, same with cerebral palsy. Like there's all of these different physical and neurological conditions that do not actually impact your ability to do a job. But when you ask AI without this level of intention to make assessments, it's making assessments on like decades of data, which is not inclusive of these groups. And so you have to be really careful when building these models to make sure that and again, what happens, like to Steve's point earlier, it's expensive. Now I'm asking companies to invest in more data collection, in people that don't want to share their data. So we have to pay them, which is just a totally different dynamic. Enter the world of Web3 and decentralized data collection and paying people what they're worth for data that we'll use to make money. Like it's a really interesting time to be around.
Well, you said the magic word there, Web3. We love to talk
Right?
about that.
Well, hey, before we go to Web3,
I know. I don't think we should go there.
yeah. Noelle, I was thinking about the stuff that you've been saying now and what you said on that Latinas podcast about, legislation. Like, how do you think this is going to play out in the like legislation of ethics around AI? Because like legislating the good is super hard, as we all I think kind of really understand. What do you think is going to happen first? Where should we focus as a country?
Yeah, I think the good news is I mean, it's good and bad, but the good news is that the most harmful AI will get legislated first, which is facial recognition. But we've already started to see this, just like with GDPR. We saw people pulling back on things before GDPR became a thing when they just knew it was coming down the pipe. So IBM, Microsoft, Facebook all adjusted the way that they go to market with facial recognition. Facebook is probably still the worst because it didn't change it enough to be meaningful, but you see adjustments in how they're using their facial recognition model. But Microsoft, like they all decided not to go to market in the way that they were intending, because of the just massive amounts of data that are necessary to do it right in a human population that's global. Like it's super expensive to do. So that's the first sign, is that people will actually start pulling products out of the market, which we're already starting to see with the big companies, but even startups, right? That thought that they could, like HireVue was a startup. They obviously will they're rebranding, I think. Maybe they'll get a chance to hit another day, but that was a huge failure, Wall Street Journal level, failure that it'll be hard to recover from as a company. So there'll be a lot of those. The other thing though, I think, which is maybe, I don't know, interesting, is that there's a lot of AI that is kind of dismissed, right? Black Mirror kind of elevated a bunch of really complex AI into the limelight. When people hear AI, they think like Skynet, like the whole sentientness at Facebook. I think it was Facebook, right?
Google,
Google.
the
Google,
That's right.
yeah.
Google engineer who thought the AI was
Like,
sentient.
I
Now,
mean, okay,
Yeah.
maybe, but it doesn't matter because the world has seen enough of that enough talk about that thing at scale, by the media, that they actually believe that maybe that's true. There's so
Yeah.
many reasons why those characteristics show up, but and it's not really whether that's right or wrong or whether he did or didn't. But the interesting thing is there's so many other places for AI that we're using it today very successfully. I'll give you an example for death certificates in the United States. If someone in your family or someone dies, in order to get death insurance, it's a long process. It's super painful. It's already damaging for, like the person who's going through this, and they have to like submit death certificates and have it approved and have a conversation to vet. It's really painful. So we worked with a company and we did this design thinking session about how do we leverage conversational AI and computer vision to make this a frictionless experience for someone who's already in a bit of emotional pain. And that was the cool part, is the company was like, I recognize emotional pain in my customer. How do I create a process that makes that better for them? And that is different, right? Like that's not like the IBM of 2008, right? Or 1998 or like that's a different way of approaching the market. And so I do think that these legislative actions will hopefully start elevating these other use cases, right? When we stop worrying about is this, are we building Skynet at this research company? We now can work on, okay, like in this death certificate, they built an entire model that allowed you to take a picture of the death certificate and it automatically, presuming there was no, it didn't look like you had manipulated the image or anything like that, but it allowed you to, within 3 hours, get your claim approved and funds dispersed as opposed to 3 weeks, which is super painful in a time of, loss. So I love that there are really tangible real world experiences of building intelligence into our customer experiences, but nobody talks about that stuff. Like they're all talking about, these one-off use cases where and I do think we should focus on the Googles. I hope Web3 does destroy this kind of crazy monopoly of data that the Googles, Facebooks, Apples, Amazons, even Microsofts of the world have. I don't think it's fair that we built, a 100 million user tool like Alexa on free data. Like that seems, now that I know better, it seems like something I don't know if I feel good about, right? Like those people said yes, okay, but did they know that we'd make billions? Like, did they know? Same with Zoom. Zoom used a bunch of people. They created a product that ended up booming like crazy during the pandemic, but nobody got paid to help them be better. Like, and it wasn't theirs. It's not like they inherently created synthetic voice data to like they used our stuff to make them rich. And that kind of stuff bothers me. And that's what I think ethical AI will ultimately come down to be about. I hope it will.
Well, so I'd be curious to get your take on this. Like, I'm going to make some general statements, and I have done a little bit of research, but not much. But like, if you look at the average age of people that are in the seats of power in the government, it's above 50. It's a lot of old white men. And we've seen some of these like televised hearings where they were talking about data collection, and it's amazing how little they understand about this stuff. And that's part of my concern is as we start talking about legislating AI, like whoever spends the money to get the lobbyists into those ears of those people, they're the ones that are going to win initially. Like there's no other way it's going to happen.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Biden and Feinstein and I mean they're too old to even be baby boomers, right? They're from the before the baby boomer like generation.
World War II people before we named generations.
Yeah, I mean Feinstein was born in 1933, and that's the year they started building the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yeah,
right?
I always say like
and
that
the
was
Lincoln Tunnel.
Picasso's heyday.
So it's like they didn't even have phones in their house when they were growing up. Yeah. Like, how are they going to understand and legislate the nuance of ethical questions in artificial intelligence? I mean, give me a break.
Like the lobbyists right now, if you look at the lobbying dollars invested by Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, like it's gone up exponentially in the last few years. It's now in the like hundreds of millions of dollars. And yeah, like the way the government works through this lobbying activity, like yeah, the more you know, the worse you'll feel about it. Honestly, I
mean, that's
caution,
probably how it is. Yeah.
ignorance is bliss in this situation because you'll be wondering, like, we'll create regulation, but who did we create it for? And what is it actually? It doesn't. That's why I go after people in companies when I'm talking about responsible and ethical AI. I go after people who actually already care about it, and it's kind of like the same people that care about sustainability or climate change, right? Those are the ones that I'm going to be able to get to do something. Where if I'm talking to those that are mostly concerned with like legislation or will wait till legislation, happens, I can't be useful there. Like I have to find people that are already passionate. The good news is that there's way more people passionate now than I think even 5 years ago. That people are like, wait a second, I don't want to build AI that does bad things.
Yeah, that does bad things.
Yeah, like how do we create a system? And this is called AI governance today, but how do we create governance practices that protect or at least notify us when bad things start to happen, when decisions are being made that are not in alignment with, our metrics.
That's right. But how do we create a board of people that don't have, I guess, quote unquote, perverse incentives?
Right. Exactly.
To constantly try to align the direction of legislation towards their best interests.
Yep.
I don't know that as humans, like, we're wired any other way. Like,
when I was in college, I guess it would be like IEEE and organizations like this, we're trying to create a framework for creating a registered professional software engineer, right? Like you have to be a registered professional civil engineer if you want to build bridges and sign off
Right.
on documents. An electrical engineer goes through some certification and licensing, but there is no such thing for software engineering.
No.
And Texas, actually, the state of Texas was one of the early trying to get this done, where you'd have to study under, work for a certain number of years under another registered engineer, just like other
Yeah, like
engineering
an
disciplines.
apprenticeship.
Yeah, just like other engineering disciplines have to do that before they can become a professional engineer. So I think if we, as an industry, tried to actually make this happen, and I haven't heard about that in 20 years. That's
Yep.
not anything that anybody in our industry even talks about, mentions, thinks about. It's just not. It's just not on the
Yeah, I
table
mean, the
anymore.
only hard part about that is that instantly marginalizes everyone. Like all the free code camps and like boot camps and things like you will find that those people, and that's true in old school chemical engineering, like they're all the same kind of people that end up coming from the same places, getting certified by the same people, being in the same club, like, elbowing each other on the first class plane ticket. Like it becomes a bit of a club. That's inherent. It's just part of it. So it's challenging because I 100% agree, especially with artificial intelligence. I'm like, man, I really think you should have at least some ethical training or some, even some like liberal arts training, right? Psychology, human behavior, any of that would be helpful. None of that is required. I like the idea of it, but I also realize that those at scale, they tend to become mechanisms that become roadblocks for diversity and inclusion, which is really kind of sad. Unless there's people like us inside being like, keep the door open, and
But
that
it,
will
but it, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's any other way we found as humans to sort of keep each other in check and accountable. Like, if a doctor goes off and does some
Yeah,
some shady
good point.
shit, the AMA is going to kick them out. The state licensing board is going to revoke their license. They're not going to be able to practice
Yep.
anymore. And so they don't do that stuff, or
Yeah.
generally speaking, they don't, and they're very aware of those types of issues.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we would have to see, which is why these boards exist, right? It's like people got hurt, bridges fell, like
Well,
massive
but that
amounts of
happens in
people.
software, right? Software does kill people, and
Yeah.
has killed people before because of software
But how
bugs and
much do we don't
things like
talk
that.
about that though. We certainly don't say it. Like if a bridge fell here in Miami, it was like national news.
Oh
Like
yeah.
like sometimes I will only see it on Guardian or TechCrunch when some massive model by a big company does something. Facebook
Well, you
had
think software in the Boeing plane that was bringing
yeah,
down the
yeah,
737
exactly.
Max, right? Like,
But I mean, it was like a press cycle. Like it came and it went. No change was made to the industry that built that software, but like doctors yeah, it would,
well, I
I don't
think
know.
Boeing probably went through some major changes
Yeah.
as a result.
Yeah.
I'm sure they did.
Well, that's
Yeah,
part of the beauty of the free market is like eventually you realize if you don't change, you're going to lose. So you got to change. So I was, one of the things I thought was interesting talking about like legislating this stuff is back in 2012, this is the only data I could find on this. There was a senator that got elected that was a particle physicist, and his name's Bill Foster from Illinois. He said at the time he got elected, there was only about 4% of federal lawmakers that have any technical background. That was as of 2016. And I just looked, they actually track this. So most of the folks that are in office come from public service, or they're like professional politicians. The second one is business, which is a massive bucket of nothingness.
yes.
Then it's lawmakers, and then educators. And, it's funny, like one of the articles I read, they're talking about how the U.S. government actually uses this as an excuse. They say, oh, we're not scientists. It's kind of like Star Trek. Like,
Right.
damn it, Jim. Right.
Exactly.
But I think that we don't ever talk about this. Like maybe from a diversity perspective, we shouldn't just be talking about the color of our skin and our gender, but it's backgrounds. Like,
Yes.
why is no one in tech running for office?
Right.
Well, just speaking for
yeah,
myself, I don't
we
think
know
I could
why.
deal with the slowness of how they move. It's like
Yep.
we're used to moving fast, break things, and move quickly.
Yeah.
The government is break nothing and make sure your pocket is filled before you do anything.
Well, and just slow incremental changes in general.
Yeah, and I understand slow incremental changes, but like, why can't we also look at our government as something that could maybe move from the waterfall process to a bit more agile process?
Yeah.
But
I
this
mean,
is a
I've
whole nother
definitely thought of
discussion.
running for an office, right? I've definitely thought of it multiple times, but it's
Tell
like,
me when, I'll come campaign for you.
yeah, it's literally like you have to carry this, like you literally have to put on the mantle and that becomes who you are. Like it
Yeah.
would be, I would imagine it would be difficult depending on what I run on, but it will then alienate me from being able to actually be employable by the companies that I'm going to try and, regulate.
I guess
or-
it depends on how much of the actor persona you take on,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like, could
exactly.
someone that just wants to have real conversations run for office?
Yep,
I don't know.
right.
Not enough people appreciate the nuance of an argument. Today it's so, if you're not with me, you're against me.
That's right. If you're not
Yeah.
willing to polarize your audience, yeah,
Yeah.
and I of
Yeah.
course, I'm like, do we have to do that?
Yeah.
Do I have to talk
Well,
about
Noelle, I would
sports?
not be surprised if we see you lobbying for some
You never
ethical AI,
know. The seed has
responsible
been
use of AI.
planted.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
That would be fun.
remember when the Google Oracle lawsuit was happening at the Supreme Court, and listening to these guys who don't know anything about tech trying to reason and ask questions about what an API is, right?
I know.
Because Oracle was trying to trademark the actual Java API, and
Yes.
Google saying,
Yeah.
no, it's an API. You can have the implementation, but like you
Yeah.
can't trademark an API and
Yeah.
prevent other people from using it.
Yeah.
And trying to explain that to some 85-year-old like guy who's going to die in 6 months on the Supreme Court bench and have him understand what an API is, it's not going to happen. So they have to reason by analogy, but there's
Yeah.
no perfect analogy.
Well, tell me if you have a shared experience here. Like, when I was growing up in my tech career, to me, I thought Silicon Valley was like this impenetrable bubble of talent that I could not get into because I didn't have a degree and I didn't live there. And it wasn't until I got the job at SpringSource that I realized there was a whole nother world. And at that point, I had been in tech for 10 years. And I wonder if that stigma still exists today, or if you think like, are kids coming out of high school and university or just like trying to do it on their own, do you think they still have this idea in their mind of like, some of this is off limits to me because I'm not a Silicon Valley person?
Yeah, I actually think instead of Silicon Valley, though, it's moved more into this like entrepreneurial space and VC funding world. I see the same exact trends, though, the same like special treatment and like the same people funding the same companies. But instead in Silicon Valley, it's a little bit more diverse in location, but it's still the same types of groups. Like even in Miami, I went to a Miami, tech startup dinner, and the room was full of people who I could have sworn looked exactly like the people that I used to have dinner with in Silicon Valley when I thought like,
Yeah.
like it's the same like bro vibe. And the VC funders, like the investors, the builders, they were all the same. They all looked the same. There were hardly any women. I was just like, gosh, have we learned nothing like from, but there's no disincentive to that because it works. They know each other. They're super arrogant. I mean, you remember these days, like super arrogant. Like it was just a little disheartening though to see it in 2022, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I know. And I tried, of course, now I'm old to them, right? So I'm like, I remember Web 2.0 and I sat at a table just like this. And 9 out of 10 of you ended up dismally failing as the ESBs, died or whatever it was. So I see a lot of repetitive, challenges. We're not at the point where they're failing yet, but they're going to fall. We're going to fall down the same path of like massive startups starting up in these little echo chambers, getting lots of funding, and then they're going to die. And all of these underrepresented groups will have never gotten any funding. And then it'll be consolidated. If we do it right, it won't get consolidated into like Google's, Apple's, and Microsoft's. Hopefully, maybe there's an ecosystem where everyone can make a couple million a year and be happy, but that's not the history that I'm familiar with. Usually it becomes an acquisition fest and everyone starts, getting gobbled up by the big companies. That's the end of it. But I don't see much difference at all really I wish I did. I wish I had a better story there. We can't end with that. We have to end with
No.
something
Let's
No,
so
that's fair.
to wrap it
Yeah.
up. To wrap it
Black
up.
Mirror.
No, I think to wrap it up, can you tell us about the AI Leadership Institute and what's going on there?
Yeah, we actually almost segued into it. So I started off was part of Alexa, early member of Alexa. I think I was employee 10 on the team, only woman. We were focused on devices. It wasn't even really an application play at the time. And when I started, no one knew what natural language was or computer vision. And we were selling these things as APIs. And people were like, what do I need an API to, like, I don't even understand what you're saying. And I was one of the only software engineering focused kind of people who understood what it meant to like build a software product. Everyone else was like research or devices or IoT driven. Within a couple years, I realized nobody knew what we were going to do. And I also know that evangelism of whatever you're doing is necessary for success. Like it's the marketing part of every business. People have to know you. Being known beats being good every single day. Like if somebody knows you better than someone else, like you're going to get that business. So I got to get out there. So I started talking about it, but executives and boards who are the ones who held the purse strings for these early initiatives had zero idea, kind of like the legislation. I never went that direction, but I probably could have. But I built an entire company funded by Microsoft and Amazon. They're frenemies. Both funded this initiative to build a hyperscaler agnostic approach to AI from a business perspective. So I did 4 workshops. I sold out for right up until the pandemic. Every spare minute, I was like doing these. They were all virtual, very successful. I feel like I impacted, a bunch of companies that were going to make bad decisions about buying these black box AI startup tools, and they had no idea what they were getting, right? They were like, well, it says it's going to give me this result. I'm like, you should know what model they built, what infrastructure they're on, like all the hard tech stuff that sometimes executives don't know to ask.
Well, even just explainability of how it made that
Exactly.
decision. And
Yeah. Or just, and you don't even have to, I don't have to see your code, but it should have some way of sharing like what variables were used to make the decision, something. So I did that for a while, but then it morphed into this like education literacy space where now I focus on like universities, high schools, young kids. I have a lot of grant funding because there's, of course, a lot of STEM funding out there today that allows me to do it for free, if you will. So I can go to these schools and say, hey, I can be an AI expert in residence. I go in and I do guest lecturing at universities. I get on stages all over the world. And my job really is just to advocate for the existence of this technology and the importance of us learning how to use it responsibly. I do have 2 very large scale AI models under my belt, which is not a lot of people can say that. So I want to share with people, like nobody knows about those other than the kids, about those poor kids, who are like suffering from a poor naming choice that we made. Nobody would have gotten hurt if we called it Amazon, right? Or
Yeah.
even Echo,
Yeah.
which are valid names, but it wasn't what we
Actually,
chose to go to
my
market.
massage therapist's name is Echo.
Dang it!
I know.
See,
There's
you
no.
gotta
There,
be
you
careful.
can't.
Yeah,
You
there's
can't
no
win.
unless you call it computer, which I think we got in year 3 of Alaska.
Star
And then-
You
Trek.
should just do that.
Yes.
Okay, computer.
That's right. So that's what I do now. So
Computer.
I basically, AI Leadership Institute also, of course, is all online. So every session that I do, I record, I put it in an online learning platform, and faculty now subscribe to that, and that's where all my MIT stuff is. It's free. People just have to be faculty, have an EDU extension to be part of it. But it is funded by universities and Facebook and Amazon in order to keep it going. But it's fun. It's like not my real gig. Obviously, I get paid to like go into the Fortune 100 and teach them about responsible AI. But like this afternoon, it's Friday night. Tonight's the night where I record some live Q&A with my faculty members in case anything came up with AI. On Wednesday, when I talked to those high schoolers, they were asking me questions about security and protocols. And I was like, who are you people?
That's crazy.
It was great. It was super technical. They were asking me what
Was this like
percentage-
some sort of like a AP computer science class or something?
No, they weren't. As far as I know, they weren't even like super technical. But I think this is the future, right? These kids are born in the cloud. They know these EULAs that they keep signing. One of them asked me a question no one's ever asked me. He's like, "What happens if I don't sign that EULA?" And I was like, "Try not signing it." Like, how weird is that? That it's so ingrained in our culture to just sign those things that we don't even know we really have a choice, which you don't if you want to use the software. But like it was really interesting, very in my mind, very good news that they were asking me those questions. But then how do I make sure that they actually learn that? Like me answering it in 5 seconds is not training. So we have a lot of work to do.
All right. Well, Noelle, you're such an engaging public
Super
speaker.
fun.
It's
Yeah, no
no
kidding.
surprise that you're highly sought after for speaking on stages in front of thousands of people.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today for 2 hours. That was really nice use of your time, I think, because I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, we talked about really good stuff. I'm really glad you asked me, and it's so good because we got to like reconnect after. That never happens. I don't
I
ever
know.
like happen on a podcast.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait, we worked together 20 years ago. Or whatever. So, it's
That's
awesome.
funny.
And you made me want to come down to Miami or Ohio or wherever you
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
Shall I? Like,
No, don't. You made me. I'm already envious. Just thinking about it. I don't need the proof. All right, I'm just going to have faith, like Steve said.
that's right. Yeah.
Well, hey, if you're a female engineer listening to this podcast, consider switching to become a solution architect because we need more of those.
Yeah.
Right?
right.
Follow Noelle's path, and you could be as successful as she is.
Yes.
All right?
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.